Can you hear me? Wonderful. Thanks for your patience. We were testing out some audio, making sure that some film clips that are going to be part of this presentation are audible. So as you're getting settled, let me introduce our guest faculty for this craft talk. Joshua David Bellin, to my left, has been writing novels since he was 8 years old, though the first few were admittedly very short. A college teacher by day, Josh has published numerous science fiction and fantasy novels for teens and adults, including the deep space adventure Freefall and the multi-book Survival Colony series and Ecosystem Cycle. His work features extreme environments, complex characters, and immersive world building. He's excited to work with students in all forms of speculative fiction as well as YA. In his spare time, Josh likes to read, draw, watch movies, and spend time in nature with his kids. He's the world's worst singer, but he plays a pretty mean air guitar. Oh yeah, and he likes monsters, really scary monsters. Please welcome Josh Bellin.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Sheila, for the nice introduction. And I should tell you folks, first of all, I'm sorry for bringing the rain. I did not mean to bring the torrential downpour, but I guess I did. One thing I want to tell you, when I first met Sheila, we were talking on the phone, and I told her that I grew up about a 5-minute walk from the main Chatham campus, which at that point in my youth was the only Chatham campus. So I spent much of my youth on that campus being chased off that campus by campus security because I fields and play games and everything. So it's really nice for a change to be invited to the Chatham campus instead of being chased off of the Chatham campus. So I'm excited about that. Okay, everybody can hear me? Okay, the mic's working and everything? All right, so can I minimize this? Yes, I can. All right, good. So let's get started with the PowerPoint. All right, so I am primarily, as Sheila said, primarily a writer of speculative fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, a little bit of horror, some of it for young adults, some of it for adults, some of it kind of crossing over. And so one of the things that I focus on, and any speculative fiction writer does focus on, is world building. But this talk, I'm not going to focus entirely on speculative fiction. My examples are mostly going to be drawn from that simply because that's what I read and write the most. But at the same time, I think world building is by definition relevant to any form of fiction. In fact, I would go out on a limb and say it's relevant to nonfiction as well, if that's what you're doing. Even though in nonfiction, of course, if you're writing memoir or whatever the case may be, you are, of course, reconstructing the real world from your memory. But at the same time, you're reconstructing it. It's your perspective on it. You're building it. You're always building a world when you're writing. The world is not just given to you on the page. You, the writer, are actively building it. So although most of my examples will be from speculative fiction, I hope you will see that the things that I have to say about world building are really relevant no matter what genre you specialize in. I think that as a speculative fiction writer who focuses so much of my thinking and my writing on world building, I sometimes feel as if there's a misunderstanding about what world building really means, especially for those who work in the speculative genres. I think people sometimes think world building primarily has to do with creating really cool, really wild, really out of this world stuff. And that's fun and that's important. And I would never disparage that. But at the same time, for me, I think the most important aspect of world building is what I've suggested in my title, keeping it real. World building is about conveying the impression of reality. Now, if you're writing realist fiction, you might say, well, that's easy. I'm just writing what's actually there. And it's not that easy. And of course, if you're writing speculative fiction, it might become even more complicated. But the point is that it's all about making sure that the world that you've built to be real to your readers. I listened in from Zoom on Leslie's talk, which was a couple days ago, and I found it really interesting. And she was talking about how to use one's own autobiographical experiences and translate that into fiction. I'm going to be talking about how to use certain real life propositions and certain real life principles and translate that into fiction. So in a way, there's some overlap between our talks, which I think is kind of cool, because I think this whole idea of making fiction seem real is so fundamental that I'm glad that I'm not the only one who's really who's really talking about this. So in this presentation, I think most of the things that I say are going to be fairly common sense, everyday principles, but they may be things that people don't think about that much. So I hope that they will give you some material to think about, and we will certainly have time for questions at the end. So let's start with some lessons from the master. And you may be asking, who is the master? And the answer is not me. That's the master. That's the writer, Tolkien. I hear it's actually pronounced Tolkien, but I can't say that because I've been saying it Tolkien my entire life. Was really where I started to think about the power of world building, because I think in Tolkien's worlds are just so well constructed, generally speaking. Now, this is from an essay that he published in 1939 called On Fairy Stories, by which he simply meant fantasy. When he said fairy stories, he was talking about fantasy fiction. So I'm going to read it. I will read the quotes. I know you can read, but at the same time, I'm going to read the quotes as they appear on the screen. So what Tolkien said was, what really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it while you are, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken, the magic or art has failed. You are then out in the primary world, that is to say, the real world, again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from outside. If you are obliged by kindliness or circumstance to stay, then disbelief must be suspended or stifled. Otherwise, listening and looking would become intolerable. But this suspension of disbelief is a substitute for the genuine thing, a subterfuge we use when condescending to games or make-believe, or when trying, more or less willingly, to find what virtue we can in the work of an art that has for us failed. So the idea of the primary world, which is our world, the world we inhabit right now and that we inhabit throughout our lives, versus the secondary world, which is the fictional world. And again, he's talking about fantasy fiction, but the principles apply even if you are creating a realistic world. You want the reader to be immersed in that world. You want the reader to have conviction that that world is real. And if there's a lapse in your building of that world, and it can take many forms, then you lose the reader's faith and you lose the credibility of the world. The reader is then kicked out of your secondary world into their own world, and it interrupts, it breaks the spell, and obviously it causes damage to things. And it might even, at the extreme, it might cause the reader to say, the heck with this, I'm setting this aside. I'm not going to read this thing. So you want to make sure that that doesn't occur. Tolkien, as I said, was a really great world builder, although I will say this, I just don't get how the elves can be immortal, but they can be killed. That just doesn't make sense to me, right? That's not consistent. And every time I mention this, somebody says to me, yeah, but wait a minute, what about if an elf got his head cut off? How could he still be alive? And my answer to that is, well, if you're really immortal, there's two possibilities. Either you can't get your head cut off, or you can, but you're still running around and you're still fine. Clearly, I think about these things way too much. But anyway, the point is that Tolkien, by and large, I think, builds consistent worlds. And I want to lay this out in three basic principles, which I'm going to call the 3 C's of world building, which really lay out, I think, what Tolkien is talking about. So the 3 C's, the first one is consistency. The rules of the world don't change without reason. They might change. Things might happen in the story that would lead to a change in the rules of the world. But they don't just change randomly. They don't just change because you made a mistake and forgot what the rules were. Coherence. Everything in this world fits together. Everything works with everything else. And finally, what I consider to be the most important of the rules, and it's so important that I put not only 1 C in it, but 2 C's in it, connection to consensus reality. The world that you've constructed or built abides by at least some of the underlying principles of our own world. So by consensus reality, when I say that, I mean the reality that we by and large consent to accept as real. There will be differences, right? Depending on one's religious or philosophical beliefs. Some people might believe one thing to be real and other people believe something else to be real. But then there are basic fundamental underlying principles having to do with gravity and space and that we generally consent to agree are in fact the rules of the real world. Now, this one, as I said, I think that this is the most important of the three rules. I think they're all important, but I think that this is the most important of them, that your world that you build, whether it is a realistic world or not, has a connection to the consensus reality that is shared by your readers. Obviously, if it's a realistic world, it absolutely must have that. But I would say that even if it's a fantasy or science fiction world, it must have that. I think the best, no matter how far out there your world is, the best speculative fiction is grounded in some respects in consensus reality. All right, let's move on. And I'm calling this one Lessons from the Disaster, and I'll explain why. The disaster was in fact me, and that's not me. I kind of wish that was me, but that's not me. That was a drawing that I did from the first novel that I actually completed when I was 16 years old, which actually I'm 56 now. So 40 years ago, I completed my first novel. Way back when I was working on my mom's manual typewriter. Most people these days have never even seen a manual typewriter, but whatever. That's what I had at the time. And as you can tell from the illustration, I was reading Tolkien at the time. So it was an epic swords and sorcery kind of thing, right? That's what I did. And I completed it. And of course, completing a novel, even though it was pretty short, maybe 200 pages, but completing a novel, that's a huge accomplishment. And I was so excited. And it happened that our family had a friend who lived in New York and worked in publishing. So we got in touch with him and he said, sure, I'll read a chapter or two. And so I shipped this whole thing off to him. And of course, I was like, yes, I'm 16 years old. I'm going to be published. I'm going to be a famous author. It's going to be, everything's going to come together. Well, it didn't work out that way for a variety of reasons, but he did read it closely and carefully and gave me some really good feedback, including this thing is not ready to be published and never will be, which was helpful because it was realistic. It was not going to be, this particular work was never going to be published. That was important for me to hear, much as it hurt me at the time. But the other thing that he said was that there were problems with world building. And he showed me one in particular. So there's an actual page from the manuscript. As I said, manual typewriting. But so the hero, the narrator, is a person from our own world who is magically translated to this fantasy world. And he shows up in this world and there's a castle there, right? Epic swords and sorcery, there has to be a castle. So he goes in the castle. Oh yeah. A great empty space too dark for my eyes to penetrate. That's what he describes it as. But then what this reader pointed out to me was that within a sentence or two, I was describing a space too dark for my eyes to penetrate. I was describing the dimensions of the space. I was describing these gates that were rising and falling. And what the reader said was, look, if it's truly too dark for your eyes to penetrate, then it's too dark for your eyes to penetrate. So something needs to happen. Either a light source needs to appear, or your eyes need to adjust, or I mean, if this is one of the rules of this fantasy world, anybody who enters this world develops infrared vision or something, which would be ridiculous. But the point is that there needed to be something that actually connected it to the consensus reality that we understand, which is that you cannot see if it is too dark for your eyes to see, okay? So I carried that lesson with me to this day. I thought that was a great point. He gave other examples. There were other places in this where I think there were real problems. But this is why, to me, the most important of those three C's is the one having to do with connection to consensus reality. That I think that the wild stuff, the fanciful stuff, the ultra imaginative stuff, that may seem like it's more fun, and that may be what you're drawn toward. And you may say, I'm just going to make up this world that has its own rules, and I'm just going to wing it, and I'm going to go crazy. But that might be the most fun thing. If you're writing realistic fiction, you might say, constructing this imagined realistic world is going to be the most fun part of it. And that may well be the case. But I think in some ways, the most important part of it is to have this fundamental bedrock of consensus reality that upon which other things can rest. That if you don't have that, if everything is just too fanciful, then I think it just kind of flies off into the ether and people are not going to believe it. Your readers are not going to believe it. They're not going to have a firm conviction of this reality because it's not grounded in the only reality that they really know. So that's why I think that it is the most important of those three C's. And it's the one that I'm really going to focus on, excuse me, in this presentation. All right, to do that, I'm going to start by showing another example or two of what I consider to be failed world building. And I have some film clips, which actually are working. These are from the Hobbit. Now, we're talking about Tolkien, so I'm just going to stick with it for a little while. I really loved The Lord of the Rings, and I really hated The Hobbit. And the reason I really hated The Hobbit was that I thought it was violating the rules of world building all the time in the apparent interest or service of flashy, cool-looking special effects. I don't like flashy, cool-looking special effects. I like things to be real. This, I'm not going to show this whole clip because it's kind of long, but so they're fighting this enormous goblin dude. And you'll see what happens. I'm going to start it, but then I'm going to move it toward the end. Let's see, I want to be, okay. Once the thing gets killed, watch what happens.
Could have been worse.
All right, so what's the problem here, right? Anybody want to volunteer? What's going on here? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, we've got this rickety platform, right, which is practically falling apart to begin with. It falls, apparently, given the time that elapsed, thousands of feet, smashing against rocks, all kinds of stuff. It stays intact. Everybody's fine. They conveniently had the cavern sort of narrow a little bit so it could sort of get wedged, because I guess Peter Jackson and his animators said, well, it would be completely ridiculous if it just flat landed. Nobody would believe that. But I don't believe it anyway. And then on top of it, this, 1-ton guy falls from thousands of feet and lands on them and they're all fine. It's just ridiculous. It's not credible. It's not believable. In this world that Tolkien has created, if you've read any of his novels, but in our world, mortal beings can't survive something like that. Flimsy pieces of wood can't survive something like that. We know these things. And so there is an inherent sense. Now, the next one I'm going to show is even worse, but I must show it. And if you've seen these movies, you know this one. It's okay, here it goes. I'll just show this whole clip. Yes, it's laughably stupid because we know what's going on here. Everything there is in free fall. He's in free fall. The rocks are in free fall. Everything's in free fall. Now, theoretically, physically, if we assume that his legs have a certain amount of stored, potential energy, once things initially start to fall, he could propel himself upward slightly. Think about a spring. Like a spring has that potential energy, it can be released. Okay, fine. So he could have propelled himself up slightly from the first rock, maybe. Probably not, but maybe. But then he's he's running up the rocks as they fall, and it just happens that the curve of the bridge, it wouldn't matter. They're all in free fall, as is he. And it just looks like, I don't know, Super Mario Brothers or something, right? And I think that that's the problem. The problem is that Peter Jackson had all these computer toys at his disposal. And he said, well, I don't care about realism. I just want things to look like a video game. Well, I don't think you want things to look like a video game unless your world is a video game. If it is, that's fine. I mean, I'm not disparaging that. There's lots of interesting novels that are written in virtual worlds. But if it's a real world, which I'm assuming for the duration of this talk, it's just not going to work, right? It's not credible. All right, so what I want to look at next is some examples of what I consider to be successful world building. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because I don't want to take a ton of time. But let's take a look at how these writers in what are going to be some fantasy and science fiction novels, how they lay down a fundamental base of realism upon which they can build. Let's go to the next one. All right. So this is from Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. It's from 1974. It's a sci-fi novel that's set on another planet. But just take a look at I guess I'll read it out loud. Padded body of the car. They pointed out landmarks, but in the fog, he could not tell which great, vague, fleeting building was the High Court and which the National Museum, which the Directorate, and which the Senate. They crossed a river or estuary, the million lights of Neo-Assia, that's a city there on this other world. Fog diffused, trembled on dark water behind them. The road darkened, the fog thickened, the driver slowed the vehicle's pace. Its lights shone on the mist ahead, as if on a wall that kept retreating before them. I mean, obviously, this is obviously very fine writing. It's very beautifully crafted, but importantly, the thing that I love about it is how it, even on this other world, you don't drive with your brights on in the fog, because it will reflect back at you and it will blind you, that it's this wall that's kind of retreating before you as the light reflects off of it. So in a number of different ways, the play of light and shadow, reflections, and so on and so forth, this is grounded in real principles that we understand from our own world. Now, a lot of this stuff is going to be almost invisible, I think, that for the reader, they're not even maybe going to note this all that consciously, whereas the more exciting way out there things might be of more interest to them. Same with a realist novel. They might not note these things. They might note the action sequences. They might note the moments of highest tension or conflict in the novel. Fine, that's okay. But I don't think that they will be as gripped by the whole thing and as convinced by the if you don't lay this something that's speculative. Let's take a look at another one. It is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. I hope that's not true. But anyway, okay. This is from a novel by Philip Jose Farmer called To Your Scattered Bodies Go. It is way out there. The premise of this novel, it's actually a series of 5 novels, but this is the first one. The premise is that all of humanity has been resurrected by aliens or by future human beings or by somebody and placed on this world with this enormous millions-mile-long river to do something. They don't know why. The humans have been resurrected. They have no idea why. But let's take a look at this passage that I chose, which is from relatively early in this novel. And let's pay attention to how this is using that principle of consensus reality. The blue-black, densely grained stone of the mountain itself was some kind of basalt, but there were pieces of chert scattered on the surface of the earth or sticking out of the surface at the base. These looked as if they might have fallen down from a projection above, so it was possible that the mountain was not a solid mass which had a thin edge. He scraped away a patch of the lichenous growth. The stone beneath it seemed to be a greenish dolomite. Apparently, the pieces of chert had come from the dolomite, though there was no evidence of decay or fracture of the vein. There's nothing in that wouldn't be perfectly at home, not only in a realist novel, but in a work of nonfiction. What about if you're writing a work of nonfiction in which there's mountain climbing involved, right? And there's geology and discussion or description of various minerals. All of that is perfectly consistent with that. And it grounds that world, in this case, literally grounds that world in something real, something tangible, something solid, so that all the other wild and crazy stuff can have a base upon which to rest. All right, as I said, I'm going to try to move through these pretty quickly because they're all kind of the same point. This is from, it's a longer quote. It's from a novel called Sign of Chaos by Roger Zelazny. It's a fantasy novel. And again, it's a way out concept. The idea in the Amber, it's 10 novels called the Amber novels. The idea is that there is this magical realm, it's kind of medieval, called Amber. And it is the only real realm. Everything else, including our Earth, is what's called a shadow or a projection of amber. So that is to say, we don't have actual tangible physical reality. And people who are of the royal blood of amber can travel in these shadow worlds simply by selecting what they want to be there. They select certain attributes, they drop other attributes. They're sort of like shuffling cards almost. And when the external reality aligns with what they have imagined, well, then they're there, okay? And so that's the world. So that's this way out there kind of multiverse concept. And it could have been easy, given that concept, for Zelazny to just say, I'm just going to do anything I want to do. I can, can't I? My characters can. Why not just do anything? But he doesn't do that. I'm not going to read this one out loud because it's kind of long, but just read it. This is just a descriptive passage from this novel. And let's talk a little bit about some of these specific attributes of this description that ground it in the real. All right, some thoughts. What are some of the specific things that are in this passage that give it that sense of consensus realism? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is what would happen, right? If it was snowing or some sort of, frozen precipitation coming from the air, yes, it would catch in our lashes and our hair. But then, of course, as the heat of our body, acted upon it, it would melt and it would run down our cheeks and so forth. Yeah. So it really is a careful, in that particular case, a very careful description of how we would actually experience this. Excellent. Anything else? Any other stuff in here that strikes you as being particularly grounded? Yeah, over there. Yeah, it's blowing in the wind. He has to hold it. He has to hold it here. He can't hold it here because the wind is blowing it and it could light him on fire. This is a magical human being, by the way, holding this, but nonetheless, he doesn't want to light himself on fire. So he's got to hold the thing out here, and it's the torch is blowing in the wind. Yeah, so we've got the physical world, the properties of the physical world, the way things that we would experience them. We also have like measurements. You may have noticed there's distances. This is this long and somebody's over here and somebody's over there. There's object relationships, which are laid out fairly carefully. This is preliminary to a fight scene. So it's kind of important for that reason that we know where everybody is. But at the same time, I think it helps ground it in this sense of reality. There are distances. This thing's 6 feet long. That person's to my right. That person's to my left, etc. Anything else? I saw a couple more hands. Yes, right back there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's going to be hard to stick. It depends on what the composition of the ground is, but it's going to be hard to shove something that's blunt into the ground. So it's sharpened because it's been prepared for that purpose. So there's a whole building here. Now, this is also doing other things, of course. As I said, it's preliminary to a fight sequence. So it's building tension, it's doing lots of other things. It's developing character in a lesser way. One of the things that I love, and I'll call attention to this because I'm going to return to it at the end, is when he notices the opponent. He says, his hair looked golden or even coppery by what light there was upon it, but I remembered it as a kind of dirty blonde by natural light. I love that detail. It looks this way now in this light, but in another light, a more natural light, I saw it this way. I think that's important because that gets to an aspect of world building that has to do not only with the physical world, but with how the characters perceive it. And I'll come back to that shortly. By the way, Sheila, how am I doing for time? Oh, and I have 15 more minutes. Okay, I should be able to do that. All right, I'm going to skip this one for that reason. And I'm going to talk about two principles that I think we can intuit from those examples that we had there. And the two sort of fundamental underlying principles, and again, this wouldn't apply if your novel is set in a virtual world, but assuming it's set in a physical world. First of all, establishing the properties of physical bodies in space is fundamentally important. Establishing the properties of physical bodies in space. I'm sorry, I don't have a slide that actually says that, but you need to know where things are, how they exist in, how they inhabit space. And the second thing that I think is important, and it's related, it's probably a corollary, is that you need to establish a strong sense of place. Now, I know how important that is to Chatham University. I know how important that is to the MFA program, place-based writing, which is something that I do as well. I do some environmental nonfiction. I do some of that writing on the side. And I think there's a crossover between that writing and my fiction because I always want to ground things in a very strong sense of place. I hate the word setting. I don't know where the word setting, I mean, that's, you know, that makes me think what you put on the table when you're going to eat, right? It's a place setting. Setting is so much more important. Place is so much more important than the word setting implies. Setting implies that you just have to have a sort of place where things happen. That's not what I believe. My motto, and again, I should have had a slide for this, but my motto is that the world you build isn't just where things happen, it's what makes things happen. The world isn't just where things happen, it's what makes things happen. That being, if the world is poorly constructed, nothing valuable or interesting can happen in it. If the world is well constructed, many valuable and interesting things can happen in it, okay? The world, for obvious reasons, is going to place constraints on what can happen, and it's going to shape behavior and character development and other things. But for all those reasons, the world you build isn't just where things happen, it's what makes things happen. And so this is where I want to talk about two specific ways that you can try to make sure that you do adhere to that principle and that you do build a strong world. And these are kind of, I guess these are fairly general, but the first one I'm going to say is to model your world on a place that is real. Now, this would apply if you're writing realist fiction or non-realist fiction. There are lots of good examples, I'm going to show you a few of them, of realist novels and realist series that are founded in an imagined place that is connected to a real place. So in the case of Faulkner, all of his novels, most of them take place in the fictional Yoknapatawpha County. That's a tongue twister, Yoknapatawpha, but it's connected to Oxford, Mississippi, and Lafayette County, Mississippi, which is where he grew up. So he grounds his world, even though it's fictional, and even though he takes liberties with it, he grounds it in an actual real place that he knows intimately. Ditto with To Kill a Mockingbird, which of course is Harper Lee's only novel. Go Set a Watchman, as you probably know, was the first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird and should not have been published as if it was a sequel, because it wasn't a sequel, it was a first draft. But so that's her novel, and it's a great novel. You know, it's a wonderful novel. And Macomb, Alabama, is based on Monroeville, Alabama, which is where she grew up. And then, of course, to have a more close to home example, if you've read Michael Chabon's Mysteries of Pittsburgh, which is set in and around the Pittsburgh area, primarily on the University of Pittsburgh campus. Now, he takes liberties, as do all authors when they are grounding their unreal place in a real place. Like the Cloud Factory, if you've read The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, he's talking about like that cogeneration plant in Oakland that's close to the Carnegie Library, and there's a lot of steam coming off of it. It doesn't really look the way he describes it. He uses it obviously metaphorically. It becomes a place where a lot of the action takes place. But on the other hand, it is grounded in that real place. If you've walked over that bridge, you will see those clouds or whatever coming up from that factory. You also, if you understand the behavior of clouds or steam, you will know that that's in fact how it behaves. So again, grounding things in a real place. Now, this would be the case even if you are talking about a speculative world. So this is a map that I did not draw this, a professional artist drew this for me, but it's a map. You can see the three rivers. You can see in these little, like these inserts. You see this one and this one. So the ecosystem novels, which are fantasy novels set in a future Earth where the physical environment has basically taken over and humans have been crowded to the margins. But what I did was I based it on Southwestern Pennsylvania, which I know the best. I base most of my writing, whether it's realistic or not, on the area that I know best, which is Pittsburgh and its environs. So there's actually the University of Pittsburgh plays a role in these novels. The Three Rivers play a role. Actually, Chatham, there's a reference to the Chatham main campus and to Rachel Carson. My main character comes from this kind of primitive village where people have not learned how to read. She goes to this place where people do know how to read. She learns how to read. She's a teenager by that time, and her teacher has her read works by Rachel Carson. So, you know, that was my shout out to Rachel, whose Silent Spring I have always loved. But in any event, the point is that, you know, you can ground this unreal world in a real place. And I think that inherently when you do that, you're going to put your mind, your headspace where it needs to be to make the place seem real. Now, this, as I said, is a professionally drawn map. When I do any kind of world, whether it's real or not, I draw maps, and I'm not a professional artist, so they look like that. But on the other hand, I mean, they serve my purposes. This is from a science fiction novel called Scavenger of Souls. I needed this sort of volcanic desert. I needed a river, I needed a city and a walled compound and some various other things. This is a little hard to see, but right there, that's like a canyon. So I just really sort of wanted to see physically where things were aligned to each other so that when I had people moving across this space, I knew whether they were going east or west or north or south or what they were doing, which part of the world they were moving through. So, you know, drawing a map, you don't have to be an artist to do this, obviously, but I strongly advise people to draw maps. It can be a map of the whole space. It can also be a map of a smaller space within where maybe an important scene takes place. There's another map I did, which is actually for a realistic novel set on a campus very similar to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, which is where I attended as an undergrad. And in this case, I did draw it more or less to scale because I wanted to know very carefully, very clearly, like how much distance there was between things. So if my characters were going from one building to another, I mean, you know, college campuses can be very complex in terms of the object relations and so forth. So I did want it to be pretty much to scale. It may not look like it is, but there was a scale that I developed in order to work with it. And so it was incredibly helpful. When I had descriptions of people moving through this campus, it was very helpful to have the map that I could always refer to. All right. So the two things, just to reiterate, that are helpful in grounding your world in that consensus reality and a real place. One, base it on a real place. Two, map it out. Now, I want to talk about one last thing before I'm done. And it's related to world building, but it's something that I think people sometimes overlook as an aspect of world building. They don't recognize that this is an aspect of world building. It's different from what I've been talking about up to this point. Up to this point, I've been talking about the objectively real world and grounding your writing in that objectively real world. Here, I'm going to talk more about people's subjective experience of that world. Remember, I told you just briefly when I was talking about the Roger Zelazny quote, there's that question of how the one character's hair was perceived. It's perceived a certain way in this light, it's perceived another way in another light. So my assumption is that the world is objectively there and we live in it and we live with it and we deal with it, as it is. But at the same time, we also perceive it in ways that may be unique to us, or at least different from the way other people perceive it. That our perceptions of the world play a role in shaping the world. And this is really important in world building. And it's something that I don't want people to just leave aside and forget about. I don't want you to think that when you're building a world, you are merely building this mechanical construct that abides by the principles of our world, and it doesn't matter how the characters see it or behave in it or perceive it. Those things do matter. They matter in part because characters' perceptions might change. They might obtain knowledge of this world that they didn't have when they might go to a different part of this world and see it in a different way. They might grow or develop and see it in a different way. There's lots of things that can account for that. So it's not just this mechanical construct. It's this physical thing that is in interaction with this subjective mind that is perceiving it. And to give an example of this, I want to go to a great, what I would consider to be young adult novel. Everybody's read Lord of the Flies. That's one of the reasons I chose it. But it is a good novel. But one of the things that's interesting about it is realist. I don't think there's anything in there that goes beyond the bounds of consensus reality. If you can accept that these children are marooned on this island, then you can accept everything that plays out from that point forward. But at the same time, because they are young, because they are frightened, because they are having these extreme experiences, their subjective impressions of that real physical world sometimes almost seem fantastic. It's a realist novel. If what I was talking about before was grounding what might be a fantastic novel in the real, here I'm sort of talking about a world that is real that shades over into the fantastic. If we look at it, this is Simon, who is a fairly imaginative character to begin with. So I'm going to just read this. Simon looked up, feeling the weight of his wet hair, and gazed at the sky. Up there for once were clouds, great bulging towers that sprouted away over the island, gray and cream and copper colored. The clouds were sitting on the land. They squeezed, produced moment by moment this close, tormenting heat. Even the butterflies deserted the open space where the obscene thing, that's this pig's head, grinned and dripped. Simon lowered his head, carefully keeping his eyes shut, then sheltered them with his hand. There were no shadows under the trees, but everywhere a pearly stillness, so that what was real seemed elusive and without definition. The pile of guts with a black blob of flies that buzzed like a saw. After a while, these flies found Simon. Gorged, they alighted by his runnels of sweat and drank. They tickled under his nostrils and played leapfrog on his thighs. They were black and iridescent green and without number, and in front of Simon, the Lord of the Flies hung on his stick and grinned. At last, Simon gave up and looked back, saw the white teeth and dim eyes, the blood, and his gaze was held by that ancient, inescapable recognition. In Simon's right temple, a pulse began to beat on the brain. Now, again, it's great writing, all that stuff, but it's real, but it's surreal. What's the line that's in there? What was real? There's a surreal aspect to it, almost a fantastic aspect to it, not just the weird stuff, not just where he thinks the pig's head, the next scene he's going to think the pig's head is talking to him, but even the descriptions of the clouds, things sitting on the land and the light and everything else. Everything else is skewed and it's not quite the way that we would perceive it. And you might be raising your hand and say, well, wait a minute, now I'm violating that whole consensus reality thing. No, I'm really not. Here I'm talking about how this subjective experience of consensus reality further helps to build that world, because this is how the character, in this case, maybe characters in another case, perceive it. So I think there's an interplay between constructing this believable physical world and imagining that world through the eyes of whoever is perceiving it. So I think that those two together, as I said, many people I feel don't think of this as world building. I think it is, and I think it's a fundamentally important aspect of world building at that. All right, time, Sheila, am I good? I'm good. All right, so let's go to, not this, because that was for something else. I just wanted to dazzle you with some really cool thing. Let's go to this, and let's go to questions. So let me escape here so I can see, and let me bring back up my, there's everybody. All right, so if anybody has questions, come on up. And then if anybody on Zoom has questions, please chat them in and I will take a look. Are there any questions that anybody wants to ask? I will yield the podium. Is there one in the chat? I'm going to stop sharing. How do we avoid our readers calling out? How do we avoid our readers calling out the plot armor trope when our main characters survive a ridiculous situation? Well, okay. First of all, I guess the question would be, why are your main characters surviving a ridiculous situation, right? I mean, the question would be, we could go back to Legolas, right? He wouldn't have survived that. I think that the way I would answer that, if I'm understanding the question correctly, is that you want to avoid that. There can be situations where the likelihood of survival would be low. There can be situations where some sort of unlooked for intervention enables somebody to survive a situation that is improbable to be survived. But there should not be a situation where it's just not possible. Because if it's just not possible, then that's where the reader is going to call you out, and probably at that point set the book aside and simply say, they're either going to say, right, they're going to say this is this, Deus ex machina kind of thing, where you've brought in something from outside that's not really consistent with the world, just to get your character out of a tight spot, or just to get your character out of a scrape of some kind. Or they're simply going to say, this has forfeited that reality for me. I think that we saw in the two film clips that I showed, we saw that case where there was the break from reality. And in both cases, it had to do with survival and with circumstances under which survival would have been impossible. And readers just wouldn't accept it. So I think my answer to the question would be, oh, that's perfect, thank you. So I should have just looked at the chat before I kept going on. All right, so yeah, just avoid those kinds of situations. Know yourself and your world well enough so that you don't put people in those kinds of things. Okay, other questions, either chatting. Oh, I see something else on the chat. Anybody else in the room? I want to go back and forth. Okay, let's go from room to chat. So here's a room one.
Hi, sorry, I had to come all the way from the back of the room. So you were mentioning a part that I didn't even really think about is one of the things you can make up is obviously realistic places based on others, but with a name and an entirely different place that you've come up with. What are your opinions over stating that versus leaving it undefined? And like, are there any problems you can get into with creating a place that doesn't actually exist in a realistic novel?
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's a great question. The problems that you might get into in creating a place that doesn't really exist in a realistic novel. I think that your readers, if you say that something is set in Pittsburgh, then you probably should have the things that are actually in Pittsburgh. If, on the other hand, you say that let's say that you are using Pittsburgh as your basis of things, because maybe that's the city that you know well, but you decide to name it something else, and you don't even call it Pittsburgh. It's just based on Pittsburgh, the same way that Harper Lee based Macomb on some other town in Alabama where she grew up. Are readers going to be disconcerted that this place is called Macomb and they look on a map and they're like, wait, there is no Macomb. What the heck is this about? I don't think so. I think that's where readers are going to be willing to sink into that reality that you have created. It will have for you as a writer, and it will probably have for readers, it will certainly have for readers familiar with Monroeville, Alabama, but it will have for all readers, because it is based on a real place, it will have a greater conviction and a greater sense of solidity and realism and truthfulness. But are they going to step back far enough and say, well, wait a minute, there's no Macomb. This must have been based on Monroeville. I just don't think that that's a real risk that one is going to run as a writer. I think the greater risk, as I said, might be that if readers identify this as a particular place, and if you as a writer identify it as a particular place, if you, in the middle of the city of Pittsburgh, and it's a realist novel, right? It's not fantasy, it's not sci-fi. In the middle of the city of Pittsburgh, you've got a skyscraper that's, 2,000 feet tall. Well, everybody knows there's no skyscraper in the middle of the city of Pittsburgh that's 2,000 feet tall. So that you're going to run into a little bit of a problem, I think. When it comes to leaving it undefined, I mean, I think names are vitally important as part of this reel making. Things should have names. Streets should have names. Buildings should have names. Parks should have names, et cetera. In a realist novel, they should have names, because that's also part of our experience of reality. Things are named. Just about everything is named. So I wouldn't want to go so far in the question of undefined as to say, well, I'm just going to leave it up to people's imagination what the heck this place is and where the heck this place is. I would situate it somewhere. But at the same time, I would be careful that if it is a real somewhere, an actual real somewhere named as such, that you have to be fairly careful with not just who know that place will see as such. Does that make sense? Okay, yep, sure. All right, let me go back to the chat. Oh yeah, this is a great question. How do you avoid giving too much detail in the world you're building so you don't confuse or frustrate your readers? I will say right away that's real hard. And I struggle with that because I love world building so much that sometimes I just want to keep going and I just want to make things, I just want to build this world, and I almost don't even want to tell a story in it. I just want the world, right? I think the answer to that, the best answer to that would be that the world that you are building is, as I said, it's what makes things happen, which means that it is necessarily related to everything else that's happening in your work of fiction. It's related to plot, it's related to character, it's related to theme, it's related to all of those other things. And so world building just for the sake of world building should be avoided. I read a novel recently, it wasn't all that well written, and one of the things that I noticed right off the bat that told me that the writer was fairly inexperienced was that the writer kept naming the color of everything. He stepped out onto the road with his green tennis shoes. He walked over to his red car and got in. And I was like, who cares if his tennis shoes are green and if his car is red? I mean, unless that's relevant to what's going on, unless that's important to the story, to the character, to anything, maybe once in a while you might name the color of something just to name the color of something. But it just got to be this kind of obsessional pattern that clearly indicated to me the writer had it in their head, oh, I'm supposed to be descriptive, because that's what people tell me to do, show, not tell. But they didn't know what parts of the description mattered. And if you look back at all of those, and of course I will make this PowerPoint, I'll probably update it a little bit to provide some more text, but I will make this available for people to look at. And if you look at some of the examples, any of the examples that I gave, you'll see that the details are pertinent details. They are details that matter to the story and matter to the characters in terms of development, the unfolding of the plot, and so forth. So I think that that's the really important thing, to ask yourself what aspects of this world are meaningful and significant over and above grounding somebody in a real place. What aspects of this world matter for the action that is going to unfold and the character development that is going to occur? Other questions from the people who are asking questions in the room are always sitting at the way back, so that's why it's taking a long time. But they're also all wearing purple, so that's cool.
Great. So something I was wondering about was when you're trying to define like the rules or the mechanics of the world, for example, like a magic system, how do you go about doing that without feeling like it's like an exposition dump? Because like if you need to set it up beforehand so it doesn't feel like you're just changing the rules later, like.
Yes, it's a great question. That is a great question. How do you do, especially in a world that is an imagined world where there's lots of rules that are not going to be familiar to readers, even if there is that consensus reality, there's going to be stuff that you make up. right? As I said, the ecosystem novels. Well, the conceit there, or the big idea, right? The big idea there is that the physical world, the natural world, living organisms other than human beings have knitted themselves into one sentience, one consciousness, which has gotten fairly ticked off at what human beings are doing and has risen up against humanity and has eliminated most of humanity and shoved the rest of humanity into a position of subordination. So that's the big idea, right? But am I going to spend page after page explaining, here's how the ecosystem rose, here's what happened? No, I'm not going to do that, because that's when you get into that sort of info dump thing, which halts the reading, which makes the reader see the construction of the world in ways that you don't want them to see the construction of the world. It makes them see you as a writer working and thinking to make this world work. And that's not what you want. You want the world just to appear to be as it is, and the reader to accept it. And the way to do that is to make sure that the mechanics and rules of the world are revealed through scenes. They're revealed through action. They're revealed not through, let's take a pause and let's have a little sidebar and talk about the rules of this world, but let's have the rules of that world emerge in a scene that is meaningful to the unfolding of the story. So Zelazny does that all the time, and he does it quite effectively. And he does it in a really smart way. In his first Amber novel, the main character, the narrator, it's first person narration, whose name is Corwin, wakes up with a terrible case of amnesia. He can't remember practically anything. And you might say, okay, that's overused, whatever, but it's very effective in this novel, because then what happens is when he reconnects with Sybil, this power to move through shadow and shift everything, Corwin has forgotten that capacity. So we see him almost as a reader observing somebody else shift shadow and not understanding how it works, and having to puzzle it through. He's smart enough not to ask, because he doesn't want to reveal that he doesn't have his memory. But so we watch as readers a scene unfolding in which one character is shifting shadow and the other character is trying to puzzle it out, but it's a scene. So we don't see it as mechanical info dump sidebar. We see it as the unfolding of a scene. And that's the best way to do it. And I really think that as a general rule, if you've got more than a paragraph where you just kind of stop the action and explain something, you're going on for too long. It's got to take place within meaningful action. Does that help? Okay. I don't see anything else in the chat. Is there anything else in the chat or in the room, or are we out of time? Oh, did I miss it? Oh, I did. Okay. All right. Oh, let's see how I missed that. Okay. All right. Speculative writer as well. Do you have any advice for naming organisms for places that aren't on Earth? Wow. So, okay. So they should, you can do what some science fiction writers do, which of course is that they create their own whole alternative to like a Linnaean classification system. So on this planet, here's the way organisms are classified. So they create that so that then they actually have rules, whatever the language is that's used there, or whatever ways things are categorized, right? We break things down into animal kingdom and the animal, and then, there's kingdom, kingdom, class, phylum, order, whatever. I get them all mixed up. But so we do that, right? Some science fiction writers will do that they will say, well, here's the classification system, and therefore here are the names that necessarily follow from that classification system. I've never done that. I've never felt that was necessary. What I think is necessary, and again, it's part of that giving it the aura of the real, is that you don't want to, I think, go too far. You don't want something that sounds implausible. You don't want something where you make up this absolutely, wackadoodle 15-syllable word to describe something, because that's not going to carry the weight of readers who are not accustomed to things being named like that, right? They're just going to say, no, that's not the way things are named. In the ecosystem novels, which are set on Earth, but it's almost like an alien Earth because it has changed so much, what I did was I took real organisms and flipped their names around a little bit so that they would be just manipulated the names. So like instead of warthogs, there are warhogs because they're more violent, so it's a warhog. Instead of crabgrass, there's grabgrass because it catches you and pulls you under. So I had some fun with that. I'm not saying that that's, the way to do it, but at the same time, that is a way that then I could once again have that kind of resonance where it connects with something real. At times, I think it got a little silly. I mean, even grabgrass sounds kind of silly, but in the context of the world, I think it worked. And so there was a little bit of a connection between the real, but then also the unreal. And I hope that was helpful. Okay. It says it's 12. Okay, so we're done. Thank you, everyone. Oh, and everyone, since you're writers and writers are readers, I have bookmarks. If anyone wants to grab a bookmark or 2 or 3, feel free. I've got a zillion of them. These things are cheap as anything, but I like to always have them around. So I'll just have them up here, I guess. And if you want to run up and snag one, there are plenty.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Thanks so much. That was fascinating. Okay, we're saying goodbye to our Zoomers. Bye, Zoomers.